The lights hit her face, and she smiled like someone who had rehearsed that exact expression 1,000 times. Then she said a sentence that ricocheted through every feed, every headline, every gossip group in the city. "Hey, I am marrying him." She was introduced by title and by rumor for as long as anyone could remember. A family that bought hospitals and park benches. A line of businesses that made the skyline look like a ledger. She was the daughter everyone whispered about in boardrooms and at charity galas. A woman whose engagement had been an industry announcement. For 2 years, she had pursued one kind of union, a calculated merger between pedigrees. Tonight, she chose something else. Cameras clustered like bees. Microphones rose like stakes. Reporters shouted until their voices frayed. The scene smelled of perfume, cheap cigar smoke from an escort, and the metallic undernote of flashbulbs. Stay with this story, because the image you just saw is only the headline. The wound that opened in public hides a quieter betrayal, and a truth that will demand its own reckoning. The ring she lifted glinted under the lights, but the sound that echoed in the room was not applause. It was a question. Who will really pay for this choice? Now, let us go back to what led to that moment. What happened in bedrooms and boardrooms, offices and alleys before the cameras turned? She was named Celeste Moreau, and she had been raised under chandeliers and spreadsheets. Her father owned an industrial conglomerate. Her mother sat on philanthropic boards, and family pictures were as staged as their announcements. From childhood, Celeste learned the arithmetic of alliances. Love plus contract equaled stability. She loved gardens and quiet corners, but she learned early that love could be parceled and scheduled. Her childhood was a series of tutors and tutors of etiquette, but also of an unspoken lesson about what you sacrificed to keep a name intact. In the privacy of her room, she kept a small stack of torn novels and an old photograph of a seaside town she had never visited. As a teenager, she had once run away to a cheap bus station with a backpack and the stubborn belief that she could disappear into a life of her own making before her mother found her and had the driver return her with a soft tone that sounded like pity. She was educated at the most discreet schools and trained to run charities, but underneath that training was a strange, fragile hunger for authenticity. This hunger would become a fault line. The man she decided to replace at the altar, the man she had been promised to, was Victor Hale, scion of the Hale Shipping Trust. Victor was polished and political, the sort of heir who could secure a bridge contract with a look. He was also impatient and prone to perform grief like a ritual. He had a history of affairs that read like a ledger of convenience and one public apology that had been meticulously timed. When they announced the engagement, the city congratulated them and calculated the ripple effects in markets. Victor had his own backstory of privilege and pressure imposed by a father who whispered expansions and ledgers into late-night phone calls. The pressure bent him into a confident negotiator and an unreliable heart. And then there was Aaron Park, the bodyguard, who had walked into Celeste Moreau's life as a shadow. He had been hired the year the Moreau faced threats, a string of anonymous letters, and an arson attempt at a distribution warehouse. Aaron was serviceable at weddings and vigilant at charity bazaars. He kept his mouth shut, his stance low-key, and his eyes always passing over the ground as if reading its secrets. Unknown to everyone, Aaron carried small, private displays of tenderness he did not show to his employer. He carried a regret that was more like a memory of a sister lost to neglect and a promise he had once made to protect those who could not protect themselves. He had never planned to be declared in any headline, and certainly not to exchange vows beneath a chandelier, but his hands knew how to shock a room into seeing what it did not want to see. Somewhere in his pocket, the ticket stub from a city bus and a folded photograph of a small apartment that had been a home once told more of his life than his security badge ever could.
The night of the announcement felt like a trial. The press presence was precise and aggressive. Outside the venue, photographers lined the salt brick walkway, and a helicopter thudded in the distance. Fans stood behind barriers, a few holding printed signs, some with petitions, others with broken pieces of sentiment. Inside, the scent of cream roses mingled with the cleaner smell of lacquered floors. A string quartet played popular pieces, and a television crew fed live to millions. The public was not merely a backdrop, they were a jury, and the verdict would be broadcast. Celeste had long been the subject of speculation. She had been praised for poise, criticized for choices, and occasionally admired for daring. The announcement that she would marry Aaron was a rupture itself, a public inversion of years of scripts. Cameras found Aaron first, his profile stoic, his jaw holding a calm like tempered steel. He did not look like a lover on a stage. He looked like someone who had practiced stillness to hold back a tidal wave. When she moved toward him, the room exhaled. Questions flared. How could she marry below her station? Why would an heiress discard a contract? What did this mean for the Moreau holdings? What did Victor intend to do? The microphones kept asking, and Celeste kept smiling. In that smile were resignation and a quiet defiance. She wanted to claim something for herself, a small interior territory that
no contract could reach. The early days after the announcement were infected by rumor. Tabloids invented pasts and social feeds attacked with algorithms and coordinated outrage. The Moreau household staff received calls from old acquaintances who had a theory to sell. The city opinion pieces debated whether a marriage like this was a spectacle or a social movement. Some said it was performance art, and some called it a reckless surrender. The Hale camp issued a formal statement that was made of sanitized language and economic forecasts, leaving out heartache. The Hale attorney warned of contractual fallout, and the Moreau board convened emergency dinners. At the same time, small voices rose in favor. Some neighbors applauded for having seen Celeste at local bookstores, and others remembered a moment when she had lingered on a bench to help a child pick up spilled crayons. The story splintered between those who claimed she had given up everything and those who said she had at last surrendered to truth. Months before this chaos, a different pattern had taken shape. Celeste had discovered that she could not thrive inside the strict arithmetic they demanded of her. In quiet moments, she began to save receipts from small purchases, a cup of coffee, a second-hand novel, a ticket to a late movie. These were small rebellions she recorded on the back of her phone in a plain text file titled Small Proofs. She collected the textures of a life she might choose, the warm presence of a row house kitchen, the way rain hit a window, the smell of frying garlic. Aaron noticed these things because his work kept him close enough to watch, the way she folded her hands, the way she read bookmarks. He never spoke about it. His presence was a steady line in a workday full of angles and schedules. The more he stood near the perimeter, the more he learned to translate silence into language. The Moreau family reacted with the precision of a corporation that had discovered an unsanctioned expense. The matriarch, Madame Elise Moreau, convened a close meeting in the library where portraits watched from gilt frames. Her voice was formal and cold. She said, "We have to contain this. I will not have our name traded like a stock." The family lawyer, James Klein, suggested an arrangement that would protect assets if the marriage were not recognized as a legal union under certain clauses. He spoke of prenups and trusts as if they were instruments of mercy. Among other relatives, there were whispers from Aunt Leela, who wanted to stage an intervention, from Cousin Mark, whose investments now risked recalculation. The family courted politicians and corporate allies, assessing reputational damage as if it were a balance sheet. At the same time, Victor Hale made his own moves. He met with his father over bourbon and a ledger. He said, "You do not know what this does to the routes and the docks," and his father replied with numbers.
"That is why you must be diplomatic."
Victor spun his charm in public, and privately he cut lines of credit and planned a frozen merger that would make the Moreau assets harder to trade. He told friends he was devastated and asked to be portrayed as an injured party. He hired a PR firm and curated images of solitary walks and charity work. Meanwhile, the city speculated on whether this would cause a market correction or simply a popular scandal. Public provocations did not wait. Paparazzi, who had once chased Victor, found in Celeste a greater story. Tomas, a freelance photographer known for ambiguous ethics, camped near the Moreau gate. He sent images to a dozen outlets with incendiary captions. Elena Rivera, the social media strategist for the Moreau account, sent terse replies to inflated rumors. She crafted statements meant to calm some audiences and inflame others, always keeping metrics in mind. Maya, a childhood friend of Celeste, tried to be a protective presence. She texted Celeste messages full of practical advice and memory. "I remember when we ate blue cake at your 10th birthday. Remember who you are." Celeste read these messages like someone reading a map. On the other hand, Gabriel Ruiz, a local councilman, saw the upheaval as an opportunity to advertise his support for family values and posted a measured comment about tradition that neatly avoided the messy center of empathy. The city was a chorus, and each voice had its own motivation. Conspiracies even crept into private meetings. Someone suggested that the arson at the distribution center months ago had been more than random. A whisper suggested a rival had tried to weaken the Moreau public standing. Detective Harper, an investigator who had been assigned to the arson case, watched the threads of emails and invoices with a professional patience. He had an old habit of making lists on lined paper and using a red pen for contradictions. His list had names. It also had dates. He had a careful, measured voice. In an interview, he said, "We will follow the evidence." At night, he replayed recorded calls and listened to the silence between words. His background in fraud investigations made him look for motive in spreadsheets as much as in faces. A crisis unfolded when a late-night event turned violent. It began as a fundraiser organized by the Hale family, intended to remind the city of their civic contributions. A convoy of black limousines arrived, and press cameras were squeezed into a small courtyard. Someone hurled a bottle at the car that belonged to a Moreau ally, and the situation escalated. Aaron moved before anyone else could. He intercepted a man who lunged toward a vehicle. The man later proved to be hired by a group with a grudge against corporate leaders, but in that moment, the scene was raw, broken glass, high voices, and the sting of pepper spray. Aaron protected a guest, and in doing so, took
a blow that left a small black bruise by his jaw, and a deeper bruise in the story that would follow. The hospital later said his injuries were not life-threatening, but dramatic enough to give tabloid fodder. They aired footage of the moment repeatedly. Social channels argued over whether the bodyguard had acted heroically or provocatively. In the hospital, Aaron lay awake and traced the contusions on his skin with a finger, and thought of a sister who had once needed someone to pick her up from a threshold. It was a memory that moved his choices. In the weeks that followed, the legal machine turned its gears. There were formal complaints and witness statements to collect. The investigative team wrote a summary of the event that read like a procedural finding. The document stated the timeline and listed CCTV evidence and the chain of custody for a bottle considered a projectile.
It also listed persons of interest and noted that some footage had been corrupted. The description in that affidavit was technical and dry, but it shaped public narrative. Legal counsel debated whether to press charges against the instigators and how to use the footage in civil suits. The family PR teams used edited frames to construct empathy and outrage in equal measure. When a transcribed witness account contradicted a PR statement, the discrepancy was noted and would be held for leverage. The wedding that was announced subsequently felt like a theater of consequences. Invitations had been printed in gold, but the ceremony was not what people had expected. Instead of the expected union between families, the venue saw an abrupt rearrangement. The Moreau Mansion parlor, where the ceremony took place, smelled of wax and old books. The guests, a mix of tycoons and local patrons, murmured as they found their seats. There was a hush as Celeste walked down an aisle that had been prepared for someone else. Victor arrived in a pair of cufflinks and a face practiced in detachment. He rose and the vows began. He spoke in a tone that read like a prepared statement, but then Celeste paused and addressed the room with a voice that was quiet and steady. Her words were simple. She said, "I do not want to be another resolution in corporate press releases." She looked at Aaron and then at Victor. The room held its breath. Dialogues during the ceremony threaded tension with revelation. A guest whispered, "Are you sure?" Another muttered, "This is madness." A board member, Simon Langford, hissed into his phone, "We need to call the trustees now." And an aunt clutched a program as if it were an emergency manual. The officiant asked, "Do you, Victor Hale, take Celeste Moreau to be your lawful wedded wife?" And Victor answered, "I do." Then Celeste touched Victor's arm and said, "Not anymore." Victor blinked as if in a play he had not read the end to. He said, "Celeste, what are you talking about?" And
She said, "I am not exchanging my life for your contracts." The cameras exploded. Someone in the back shouted, "Scandal!" And a reporter leaned forward to shout, "Are you breaking off the engagement?" Now, Celeste said, "I will marry Aaron," and the room reacted in a tidal wave of gasps and flashes. The wedding scene contained multiple moments of sensory detail. The silk used in tablecloths rustled. There was a metallic taste in the air from champagne. Watches clicked. The string quartet hit a false note that seemed oddly timed. The chandelier refracted light into little temporary rainbows that felt like confetti suspended midair. Each faint smell of perfume registered differently on different people, a reminder that memory is layered. Those layers fed gossip. This public choice forced decisions and reactions from named figures. Madame Elise stormed from the room, leaving a small silk glove behind as evidence of a sudden exit. James Klein whispered that they would pursue annulment and spoke of the clauses that might invalidate the union. Elena Rivera authored a post explaining the Moreau statement. "Thanks for your interest, we ask for privacy," and later that thread was edited. Maya moved through the crowd like someone trying to catch fragments of her friend's gaze. Thomas took a photo that would circulate for weeks of Aaron looking bewildered, a man whose life had been tactical and suddenly intimate. Gabriel Ruiz issued a measured official comment and pushed for a mediated tone in the press to avoid economic harm to the city. Each named person had an action that carried weight in how the story unfolded. In the weeks that followed, the fallout became policy and strategy. The Moreau board called a special council meeting to consider asset protection and to decide whether to invoke clauses that would limit the legal standing of the marriage. They held votes around a long table, the minutes of which read like a transaction log. Council recommended freezing certain transfers until the dispute could be resolved in court. There was talk of a temporary injunction. The legal language moved across documents in 300-word summaries that carefully defined fiduciary duties and potential breach of trust. The council wrote paragraphs citing precedent and outlined steps for litigation.
The technical description of procedure explained the filing of motions, an initial discovery phase, and depositions followed by the possibility of settlement or trial. The document was clinical but decisive, and it guided the family's next moves. In parallel, an undercurrent of betrayal ran through the social circles. A former associate of Victor, a man named Leo Marchetti, who had been dismissed from a logistics board earlier that year, began to leak documents implying that the Hale shipping lines had engaged in tax evasion schemes. The leak was strategic and corrosive. The documents pointed to transferred invoices and shell companies in neighboring states. A secondary story ignited around alleged financial misconduct, and the city court opened an inquiry. Detective Harper cross-referenced claims and
found troubling overlaps. The investigation file grew with emails and bank transfers, and the procedural notes included a brief explanation of tracing funds and requesting subpoenas to financial institutions. Those lines in the file were short and efficient and told the story of how evidence moves through the system. As the scandal matured, a pattern emerged in the press cycles. The more serious the allegation, the more the family tried to control the narrative, and the more other voices rose to challenge them. A small army of commentators weighed in, legal analysts and private investigators offering televised conjecture. The city's gossip columns drafted moralizing narratives, and the public split between sympathizers and scorn. The Moreau name began to show dips in certain market indices, though nothing terminal yet. Those shifts were watched closely by investors. Against this backdrop, Celeste and Aaron developed a private life that the cameras could not quite capture. Their conversations were not on the record and often took place after midnight, with the city as a low hum behind them. They exchanged dialogues of small domestic details and confessions. In one particularly long scene, they rehearsed what it meant to begin as an unconventional couple. The conversation was meticulous and tender. Celeste said, "How will they see us? What will they think?" Aaron replied, "They will say what they want." I asked, "But will you be ashamed?" He answered, "No." I asked, "Will you leave when things get harder?" He said, "I have nothing to leave to begin with." Our exchange meandered from practicalities to childhood recollections and settled on a promise. He said, "If you are choosing something true, I will stand by you." She touched his hand, and it felt like a small, deliberate map. Their dialogue was full of stops and starts, moments of laughter and moments of silence, where the city's distant noise filled the space. Those scenes had sensory flourishes, the smell of takeout food, the scratch of a record player, and the pressed linen of a borrowed shirt. They also held small confessions. Aaron told a story of a sister and a night he had tried to save a friend from a dangerous street. Celeste revealed a moment when she had thrown away a promise to please someone else. The intimacy of these lines humanized a headline. The media continued to apply pressure. A televised interview amplified a leak and invited pundits to speculate about motives. Tomas released a sequence of photos capturing Aaron alone at a cafe with a half-finished pastry and a look that the captions insisted meant grief. Maeve, a freelance blogger, wrote an analysis that contrasted the Moreau family's public interventions with their private hostility. Her article generated thousands of comments. In the comments, one reoccurring question posed itself: would you choose to be happy if it meant losing everything? This question arrived in the inboxes of the protagonists like a bell and forced them to reckon with more than the market consequences. Then a new antagonist emerged in the form of a calculated subplot. It involved a distant relative of the Moreau family named Roland Moreau, a cousin with investments in construction and a long grudge about being passed over. Roland saw Celeste's choice as a threat to the careful architecture of family connections he had planned to exploit. He began to scheme. He met with Leo Marchetti, who had grievances with Victor, and together they constructed a plan to leverage the scandals into influence. Roland's subplot unfolded in a sequence of actions he took to destabilize both the Moreau and Hale positions.
He arranged anonymous tips to reporters, he funneled funds to a shell company that bought shares quietly, and he pulled strings at a municipal hearing to delay a bridge approval that would harm Victor stocks. He cultivated a network of allies among minor board members, promising them positions once the shakeup occurred. In private, Rowland said, "When the ledger rewrites, I will rewrite my name at the top." His moves were slow and bureaucratic, but effective, quiet manipulations that read like white noise until the pattern sharpened. The subplot demanded about 2,700 characters to show its complexity: the meetings, the hush money, the fabricated invoices, and the eventual consequences. It was a study in how ambition worked under the veneer of respectability. Flashbacks punctuated the present story with memories that reframed motives. In the first flashback, Celeste was 8 and sat in a small diner with her father. He showed a ledger and explained the responsibilities of their name. She watched the numbers and felt a boxed destiny. The scene smelled of fried batter and coffee. The waitress poured syrup, and the noise of the television was distant. This memory explained why she would later dread becoming a number. In a second flashback, Aaron was a teenager knocking on his sister's apartment door and finding silence. The door was half open and a smell of bleach lingered. He ran into the scene and called for help and vowed then to never leave someone behind. That memory was a stitch at the center of his protective instincts. In a third flashback, Victor sat in a boardroom and watched his father point at charts like a general. Victor had once promised to measure his life in percentages of gain and loss, and that promise crystallized into his later decisions. Each flashback was vivid with sensory detail and extended around 1,400 characters to allow the reader to inhabit their pasts. As the tensions rose, there were moments of public confrontation designed to humiliate. At a charity gala, an anonymous speaker interrupted a speech to read an alleged contract that suggested the marriage had been part of a larger exchange. The accusation was petty and public, and it aimed to shame Celeste into submission. She stood with Aaron at her side with an expression that became a quiet shield. The revelations affected reputations, and
the city demanded accountability. The legal machinery clicked into place with motions filed and counter-motions prepared. A technical paragraph explained the discovery process. Attorneys would request bank statements, subpoenas would be issued to financial institutions, and forensic accountants would be retained to trace funds. The language was formal and the steps methodical, but the emotional stakes remained raw. At the 1/3 mark of this drama, the narrative pauses to invite an audience reaction. For a moment, the story asked, if you were in Celeste's place, would you keep your title or take a chance on love? If you were Aaron, would you risk a life of uncertain security for a woman who was a flashpoint of public curiosity? The comment box imagined by the story became a place of moral debate. The invitation asked readers to begin their reply with, "I would forgive" or "I would not forgive," to help others see what they believed. The community's pulse mattered because it shaped conversation and future episodes. The confrontation intensified when a secret emerged. A raw piece of footage leaked, showing a late-night meeting in a parking garage, a delivery, and a heated exchange. The clip suggested collusion between a board member and a dock manager to shift invoices. The footage was grainy, and a whispered voice could be heard saying, "Make sure the transfer looks like a loan." The leak shifted public suspicion and turned attention away from Celeste's private life and back to public corruption. Victor lost his cool in a press conference and snapped at a reporter for the first time in years. His father admonished him later in private, and the strain split him more. Witnesses came forward, and the city's judiciary opened a preliminary inquiry. The discovery moved into legal documents and an accountant's review that would later be used to support criminal charges if the findings held. The tension reached a dramatic apex in a public hearing where numerous characters converged.
Testimony came from a former logistics executive named Sophia, who had been fired, and who provided records that contradicted earlier statements. Detective Harper presented an annotated timeline showing transfers and anomalies. The councilman Gabriel Ruiz defended the city's need for clear oversight and promised hearings. The courtroom smelled of varnish and the heat of bodies under lights. Questions rang in short and heavy bursts. The longer the testimony went, the more rhythms of silence and sudden revelation fell upon the room. Each time a name was called, the press pushed forward, and the microphones filled the silence. At this point, counterattacks were launched. Aaron and Celeste decided to reveal evidence they had discovered in private recordings that suggested someone had been orchestrating leaks to harm Victor and the family's public standing. They produced a small cache of emails and a notarized ledger that showed transfers tied to Roland Morrow's shell companies. The production of these documents was dramatic and cinematic, with envelopes sliding
across polished tables and the recorded voices playing with an immaculate clarity that undercut previous denials. An investigation into Roland's dealings followed, including subpoenas for his corporate shell. The technical note for this kind of inquiry described how investigators traced IP addresses, calls, and bank routing numbers over a period of months and correlated them with transaction timestamps. The description was concise and informed readers of the methods used. A final confrontation occurred in the Morrow Library, where Celeste faced her mother, Madame Elise. The conversation was a prolonged exchange filled with decades of expectation. Elise said, "You have not only betrayed the family, you have endangered everything." And Celeste answered, "I have chosen something honest for once. Your silence was permission, and you chose ledger over person." Elise recoiled as if struck. Their dialogue stretched across many lines of accusation and apology. Elise demanded that Celeste consider her duty. Celeste said, "I have always known my duty, but I will not make myself a sacrificial contract." The room smelled like dust and the cold of old paper. This confrontation was a turning point that forced a re-examination of values. The denouement began as legal and social consequences crystallized. Roland was publicly accused of influence peddling, and a municipal audit launched that would cost him millions in fines and discredit. Victor faced a civil inquiry into shipping transfers and had to step down temporarily from a board while investigations proceeded. The Morrow family agreed to a partial settlement to prevent a prolonged trial, though they maintained that Celeste's choice was legally binding. The corporate board restructured, and Simon Langford resigned from a trustee position. Leo Marchetti saw his role burnish his reputation as a whistleblower and received protections in exchange for his testimony. The epilogue began 1 month later. 1 month later, Celeste and Aaron had moved into a small townhouse that had once been a bakery. The rent was modest and the landlord was forgiving. They lived with fewer comforts but more nights of unscripted laughter. Celeste had launched a small nonprofit that focused on urban food programs and had donated a portion of her private funds to sustain it. Aaron taught self-defense classes in youth centers and enrolled in a night course in conflict mediation. The Morrow name stabilized in the markets, though it bore the scars of reputation shifts and had lost certain contracts totaling over $10 million in projected deals. Madame Elise had made a public statement about family and privacy and had quietly begun therapy to address her need for control. The public reaction had shifted from outrage to a curiosity about reinvention. 3 months later, Celeste's small nonprofit had a modest but measurable impact. The food program served over 500 meals a week and received support from unexpected quarters, including a foundation that had previously donated to a Hail initiative. Victor had resigned from the Shipping Trust board and began private therapy to address his pattern of choices. Roland. Morrow faced a civil penalty and an audit that revealed a series of improper transfers amounting to several $1 million.
A municipal committee recommended further investigation and a partial restructuring of contracts favoring local oversight. Detective Harper closed one portion of the criminal inquiry, citing lack of sufficient evidence for certain charges, but left open the potential for future subpoenas. Aaron and Celeste had become the subject of profiles that tried to parse whether their union was a publicity stunt or something resilient. They kept living their life with a small, steady determination. 6 months later, the city had rearranged certain alliances. The Moreau Corporation had appointed a new CFO who initiated transparency measures and published quarterly reports to rebuild trust. Share prices had recovered partially, and key contracts were renegotiated with clearer compliance measures. Victor launched a small consultancy focusing on humanitarian logistics as a way to rebuild his public image. Roland Moreau faced a sentencing hearing for charges that had been elevated from civil to criminal after further evidence surfaced. The final penalty included restitution and a professional ban from municipal contracting for 5 years. Celeste's nonprofit had expanded into 3 neighborhoods and secured a recurring grant of $200,000. Aaron had been offered a formal security consultant position for community safety programs and had become a local advocate for protective services training. The story that began as an unthinkable wedding had reconfigured reputations and redistributed power across the city. People had been punished, shareholders had shifted, and some bridges had been mended while others remained closed. In the end, the public seemed to grow less punitive and more interested in the personal arc. Celeste reflected on the experience in a quiet journal entry she read aloud once to Aaron. She said, "I thought a name would be my fortress. I was wrong. A name is only a part of a person, and sometimes you have to lose the fortress to find a home." The final image was of them on a small row of stone steps outside their townhouse at dusk, holding a single paper bag of groceries and laughing at something private. The city around them continued to hum with work and scandal and commerce, but for once the headlines did not define them, and they had the odd solace of being 2 people who had chosen each other despite the cost. If this story touched you, consider how you would weigh duty and desire. Would you give up a title for a life that is uncertain? Would you trust someone who had once been a shadow? Start your reply with "I would forgive" or "I would not forgive," and tell us why. Your thoughts help shape which stories we bring next to light. The dress that once made the papers now hung in a closet, unused, and the ring that stunned the press had been resized and worn modestly. Contracts had been rewritten, and some board members were replaced. There had been fines, arrests, and resignations, but there had also been a small new garden where the bakery used to be. At the end of the story, the quiet proved stronger than spectacle, and a broken sequence of expectations had been rerouted into a life that was messy and true. If this narrative resonated with you, leave a comment and share what you would choose, because our community learns from how you answer. And remember, titles can open doors, but they cannot make a heart forgive or forget.